Have you ever had a perfect plan? I mean, a plan so meticulously crafted that you've thought of everything. Every single variable is accounted for, every contingency is planned out. Success isn't just likely, it's a sure thing. So what happens when something you knew was impossible, something you had already written off and removed from the equation, suddenly just shows up? What does that do to your perfect plan? Well, that exact thing happened in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where a ghost ship, a warship confirmed sunk, literally crossed off the books, rose from a watery grave to completely change the course of World War II. This is the incredible, and I mean incredible, story of the USS Yorktown.
Okay, so picture this. It is June 4th, 1942. You're Admiral Yamaguchi on the bridge of the Japanese carrier Hiryu. You are at the absolute pinnacle of your power. A scout plane drops a message, and you're looking at a photo that it makes no sense. It shows an American aircraft carrier, a Yorktown class, launching planes against your fleet. And your first thought is just impossible. Because you know with absolute certainty that the Americans only have two carriers left in the Pacific, the Enterprise and the Hornet. You know this because you were there less than a month ago at the Battle of the Coral Sea, when the third one, the USS Yorktown, was turned into a burning, crippled wreck. You saw it yourself. Your pilots reported it sunk. Back in Tokyo, her name was physically struck from the list of enemy warships. She doesn't exist anymore. And yet, there she is, right in front of you, fighting.
That one question right there, it wasn't just a tactical problem. It was like an earthquake that just ripped through the foundation of Japan's entire strategy. You see, the Imperial Japanese Navy, under the brilliant Admiral Yamamoto, had laid the most perfect trap imaginable at Midway. They brought 4 of their most powerful carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, against what they knew for a fact would be only 2 American carriers. It's simple math, right? 4 against 2. It was a guaranteed victory that would completely wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet and give Japan total control of the ocean. But the appearance of this ghost ship, this third American carrier, completely shattered the math. All of a sudden, their perfect ambush was falling apart. And to understand how this happened, how this was even possible, we need to rewind the clock 27 days to the very moment the USS Yorktown was officially killed. All right, so let's go back. We're going to May 8th, 1942. In the middle of the Coral Sea. This is where the Yorktown's first life comes to a very violent end. And you have to understand, the Japanese pilots who found her, they did their job perfectly. From their point of view, the ship they left behind was basically a floating bonfire, never to fight again. And honestly, they weren't wrong to think so. They had every single reason to believe it was over. A Japanese dive bomber pilot gets a perfect run on her. A 250-kilogram bomb, over 500 pounds, hits the flight deck. A perfect bullseye. But it doesn't just explode on impact. No, it tears through 5, count them, 5 separate steel decks, one after the other, before finally detonating deep inside the ship's guts. The blast kills 66 American sailors in an instant. Fires are raging everywhere. The ship is listing, crippled, and trailing a massive oil slick. To the pilots flying overhead, this is a textbook kill. Admiral Takagi radios Tokyo with the official report. Yorktown-class carrier eliminated. And back in the war rooms, an officer takes a pen and draws a firm line right through her name. She's gone. For all intents and purposes, the USS Yorktown is at the bottom of the Coral Sea.
But here's where the official story and reality start to split apart. In Tokyo, the assessment was crystal clear. The ship was mortally wounded. If, by some tiny miracle, she didn't actually sink, she would need at least 3 months, 90 days of massive repairs in a dry dock. But on the Yorktown itself, something else was happening. The surviving crew, in what was really a preview of the miracle to come, just refused to let their ship die. Damage control teams fought the fires, they sealed off flooded compartments, and they got her moving again. Not just crawling, but limping away at a steady 20 knots. They weren't waiting for a shipyard. They were on their long trip home, patching giant holes with scrap steel, making ugly but functional fixes while still out in the open ocean. That journey back to Pearl Harbor was in itself a small miracle. But the ship that finally arrived was a wounded animal, a shadow of its former self. And as it limped into port, the crew was about to be given a deadline that wasn't just tough, it was flat out impossible. So on May 27th, when the Yorktown finally gets to Pearl Harbor, the sight of her just stuns everyone on the docks into silence. She was trailing a 10-mile-long oil slick, a bleeding wound that stretched back to the horizon. The shipyard's best engineers swarmed the vessel, and their verdict was grim, and it was unanimous. Every single one of them said she needed at least 90 days in the dry dock. 90 days to cut out all that twisted steel, to repair the shattered machinery, to make her a warship again. But here's the thing. They didn't have 90 days. They didn't even have 90 hours.
Admiral Chester Nimitz, the top commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, comes down to see the damage for himself. He actually walks through the crippled compartments, wading through ankle-deep, oily water inside the dry dock. And after seeing the devastation with his own eyes, he turns to his stunned engineers and gives them the order you see right here. 3 days, not 90, 3. Can you imagine the silence in that dry dock? This wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that just flew in the face of every law of physics in naval engineering. It sounded like complete madness. But Nimitz wasn't mad. He knew a secret, a huge one.
Just a few hundred yards away from that dry dock, hidden in a basement known as Station Hypo, a team of absolute geniuses, these eccentric, brilliant codebreakers, had just pulled off one of the greatest intelligence victories of the war. They had cracked JN-25, the main Japanese naval code, and the messages they were intercepting told them everything. They knew the Japanese were planning a massive attack. They knew the target was a tiny island called Midway. And most importantly, they knew the exact date, June 4th. This secret intelligence changed everything. Nimitz's crazy order wasn't madness anymore. It was a desperate, calculated gamble. The Japanese were coming with 4 carriers expecting to fight 2. The resurrected Yorktown had to be the 3rd. She was the surprise. She was the only thing that could turn a certain defeat into a fighting chance. And this, right here, is the heart of the story. What happened over the next 72 hours in Dry Dock Number 1 at Pearl Harbor wasn't just a repair job. It was a revolution. It was 3 straight days of organized, brilliant, frantic chaos that would literally redefine what the word impossible even meant. Before the last of the water was even pumped out of the dry dock, 1,400 civilian workers just swarmed onto the ship. Welders, electricians, shipfitters, machinists. They descended into the dark, wounded hull and they just started working. Around the clock. They didn't stop. They ate sandwiches where they stood, they'd take 15-minute power naps leaning against a steel bulkhead and then get right back to it. The sound of their welding arcs was constant, and they drew so much electricity that they actually caused rolling blackouts across the entire island of Oahu. This was way more than a repair, it was an all-out mobilization.
So how on earth did they do it? Well, the answer comes down to a fundamental clash of philosophies. You see, the Japanese approach to engineering and shipbuilding was all about perfection. It was a matter of honor. If a part was damaged, you meticulously cut it out and replaced it with a flawless new part. Quality was everything. Time was secondary. But the American philosophy, born out of pure desperation in that moment, was completely different. There was one single rule. Make it fight, function over form, speed over everything. Forget the manual. For them, time wasn't just a factor. Time was the only thing that mattered. And this slide just shows that philosophy in action. That massive bomb damage, the job that should have taken a month, instead welders just slapped huge steel plates directly over the holes and welded them on. It was like a giant metal band-aid. Took them 18 hours. Those ruptured fuel tanks that would normally take 2 weeks to safely clean and repair, they just plugged the holes with a special quick-drying cement they normally used for airport runways. And the damaged boilers, they didn't even bother replacing them. Engineers just rerouted the pipes around them. The ship wouldn't be perfect, she wouldn't even be at her top speed, but she would be able to launch planes, she would be able to fight. This quote from an electrician who was actually there, Lewis Walters, it just says it all. Everything was temporary, ugly, but functional. They ran new electrical cables right across the decks instead of through the proper channels. They hammered wooden wedges into cracks in the hull before welding over them. I mean, it was ugly. It probably broke every naval regulation in the book. But it worked. On May 30th, just 72 hours after she entered that dry dock as a helpless wreck, the USS Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, with shipyard workers still on board, still frantically finishing jobs as she headed out to sea and to her destiny.
So they pulled it off. The impossible was done. The ghost ship was back. But the biggest question of all remained. Could this patched up, ugly, barely held together carrier actually make a real difference in what was about to be the biggest naval battle of the entire war? Well, let's head to the Battle of Midway and see how this incredible gamble paid off.
Her impact wasn't just important, it was absolutely decisive. First, just by showing up, she completely shattered the confidence of the Japanese commanders. Their whole plan was based on a 4-2 advantage, and suddenly, it's a much more even 4-3 fight. Then she drew blood. It was bombers from the Yorktown that found the Japanese carrier Soryu and landed the hits that sent her to the bottom of the ocean. But maybe her most important role was as a giant shield. When the last Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched 2 desperate counterattacks, both waves of planes went after the Yorktown.
And by absorbing those devastating hits, she saved the Enterprise and the Hornet, leaving them totally untouched and free to launch the final battle-winning strike that sank the Hiryu.
So here's the key takeaway. The Yorktown's greatest weapon at Midway wasn't really her planes or her guns. It was her very existence. Her presence on the battlefield was so confusing to the Japanese pilots that they actually reported attacking 2 different American carriers. They just could not wrap their minds around the idea that the burning wreck they left after their first attack could possibly be the same ship that was fighting again just a few hours later. She turned their perfect plan into total chaos.
In the end, the Yorktown herself didn't survive the battle. 2 days later, crippled by those air attacks, a Japanese submarine found her and delivered the final blow. But her mission was complete, and the legend of what happened in those 72 hours at Pearl Harbor would create a legacy that would echo throughout the rest of the war.
When you look at it like a balance sheet, the return on that 72-hour investment is just mind-blowing. The investment? 3 days of frantic, rule-breaking work by 1,400 people. The return? The sinking of a key enemy carrier, the survival of America's own fleet, and the decisive victory at Midway that effectively ended Japan's ability to expand in the Pacific. That single victory was the turning point of the war, and it was a turning point that was literally hammered together with steel and sweat in a Hawaiian dry dock.
And just think about this number for a second. The Americans repaired their ship 30 times faster than the Japanese believed was humanly possible. That's a 3,000% difference. That number tells you something really profound. It showed that Japan wasn't just fighting American ships and planes. They were fighting an entire industrial philosophy that could just operate on a completely different level, one where pure necessity and raw ingenuity could just shatter the known limits of what was possible. And that was a gap they were never, ever going to close. But maybe the most powerful summary of all comes from the enemy himself. Years after the war, Yahachi Tanabe, the submarine captain who finally sank the Yorktown, was given a tour of Pearl Harbor. They showed him the very dry dock where the miracle happened. And in that moment, he said he finally understood what they had truly been up against. His reflection says it all. They weren't just fighting a nation. They were fighting an idea, the idea that anything is possible.
And that's the real legacy here, isn't it? The story of the Yorktown is so much more than just military history. It's this timeless example of human ingenuity, of grit, of the sheer power of will. It really makes you ask, when is good enough actually better than perfect? And it proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is just the stubborn refusal to quit when everyone else has already written you off. The Japanese had a perfect plan, but perfection can be brittle. And at Midway, their perfect plan shattered against an ugly, imperfect, but totally unstoppable will forged in steel. So the question I'll leave you with is this one. What happens when a perfect plan runs headfirst into an enemy who simply refuses to accept that something is impossible?